Littell. I'd like to just call on Jeremy Littell. He's the ecosystem team co-lead, but also he's our first presenter. So please introduce yourself, Jeremy.
Thanks, Jonathan. My name is Jeremy Littell. I'm sorry you can't see my camera. It doesn't seem to work since I shared the screen earlier. I'm with the US Geological Survey and the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center, and also a co-lead of the Terrestrial Ecosystems Collaboration Team, along with Steve Gray and Mike Falkowski. And our interest from the terrestrial side of things actually picks up very clearly where Wilbert just left us. And our participation in this is motivated both by the need to model better climate impacts on systems in Arctic and Boreal, and in particular for Alaska and Northwest Canada is where we work, but very much we work toward the interest of various stakeholders who manage resources in the region. And so a lot of the modeling efforts that I'll talk about on our side of things are motivated by research decision-making needs and the limitations of data streams to help inform those models, and then also to adapt them better to the processes we're attempting to simulate will be a focus of our conversation.
Great, thank you. And our second speaker is Brian Wee from Massive Connections. Brian is very active in the Earth Science Information Partners, and through that, they have a collaboration team that is focusing on wildfire and agriculture and climate. And I will let him introduce himself, but I just wanted to say he was brought in because his research directly relates to the overall theme of connecting data and models and understanding how those both can inform policy. So Brian, do you want to say something about yourself?
Sure. Hi, Jonathan, thanks for inviting me to give a presentation on behalf of the Earth Science Information Partners ESIP Agriculture and Climate Cluster. I just want to acknowledge here that the co-chair of the group, this group called Agriculture and Climate Cluster, the ACC, the co-chair, my co-chair is actually Bill Ting from NASA Goddard, who is on this call. And I will say a little bit about myself and my areas of interest a little bit later on. So I'll pass it on back to you, Jonathan.
Okay, so thank you, Brian. That was perfect. So we are scheduled to have the first presentation by Jeremy Littell. And so I'll pass it off to him. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Let's make sure that this works as it did before. Can you see that?
That looks good, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I didn't break it. All right, thanks for the opportunity to talk with you, and also for taking time out of your morning this morning. I'm going to put forward kind of a where we're at presentation on something called the Alaska Integrated Ecosystem Model, which is a now decade-long effort to try and incorporate other modeling efforts that were pre-existing into a more integrated approach to understanding Arctic and Boreal futures given climate change in Alaska and Western Canada. As I mentioned earlier, we very much have a focus on the usefulness of this information and projected scenarios of change for resource management and decision making. So as such, a lot of our work is at least collaborative in nature. We aim for co-production when we can. We're not always able to achieve that for a variety of reasons, but that's another talk. So I'm going to talk about the availability of data from the model, also a little bit about limitations of existing observations and data for where we are at and can go, but more about the modeling environment and limitations there, and then also the uses that we're engaged in at the moment with different stakeholders. So the integrated ecosystem model was originally conceived of as an integration between several existing models that focused independently on landscape fire, permafrost, and ecosystem fluxes, carbon and methane, atmosphere ecosystem exchanges, things like that. It grew out of a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service workshop back in 2008 that was focused on changing Arctic habitat and landscapes. And in that workshop and dialogues surrounding it, the realization that a lot of these modeling efforts to understand future landscapes really needed much more integration between the permafrost, terrestrial ecosystem, and disturbance elements that drive the changes that we see in the Arctic and boreal systems. And so the idea to couple existing models rather than invent something from scratch, or to try and downscale or rescale, say, coarser processes from Earth system models or dynamic global vegetation models, was born. There was also, though, a very strong element at the very beginning that management of resources and landscapes in Alaska and Western Canada was part of the focus of this modeling effort. It wasn't just to understand systems or just to quantify impacts or publish scientific literature. It was also to work with decision makers and managers to better understand the potential scenarios of future change, and then what conservation actions could result or might change in terms of adaptation or at least preparation for climate change. And so the idea was to bring together the collective understanding and existing model efforts to try and couple them better to get a better idea of what the future impacts on landscapes might look like. So what is the integrated ecosystem model? The structure of it is intentionally, initially anyway, to have downscaled climate futures, so directly from global climate models, and then historical climate, feeding temperature, precipitation, and other existing factors into three separate, originally separate models. One is a landscape state and transition model focused on disturbance, fire in the boreal and Arctic, and that's al fresco. And then in the middle, there was a process biogeochemical model called DOS-TEM. And then on the right, the GIPL, or Geophysical Institute Permafrost Labs permafrost model, which is a geophysical thermal model of permafrost persistence and active layer depth at different locations around the Arctic. And each of these has some factors in common with the others in terms of observation and data streams that inform the models. And the idea was then to pass these among or between the models as it made sense and was required by the model structure to better couple or integrate those three modeling efforts. And they're all three very different. If you're deep into modeling, you know that these are three very different approaches to both the parameterization and the just general model structure. But the idea was that these models could be integrated and maybe more quickly and for less investment produce a wide range of future scenarios that might be useful in planning. Over the last decade or so, the funding for this model and its various attached efforts have been funded through a wide range of partners and to develop the data sets, both in terms of observation or initialization, and then also the projections in climate. And that's been university and research funding, as well as agency funding, including the former landscape conservation cooperatives under the Fish and Wildlife Service, who contributed very heavily to these efforts. And all this work was done almost entirely by our partners at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I should have acknowledged earlier my co-author Scott Rupp and the IEM team. I'm presenting this on their behalf as well as ours. So many of these efforts were collaboratively tailored in the beginning towards synthesis efforts or motivated by specific products, and I'll share some of those in a little bit. But you're getting the idea, I think, rather quickly that this wasn't just modeling for modeling's sake, but also to address partner needs. And a lot of the funding was specifically motivated by requests for future scenario information by the funders. And in this case, Fish and Wildlife Service was a very strong initial funder of these efforts. The structure and composition of the model can be thought of this way. Originally, these models existed like in this graphic in the lower right, where there was a linear pass off of one set of outputs into the next, and that the timescales were not as tailored to each process as they might be. So it was we called it the linear or first generation approach. And the alfresco model kept track of fire changes on the landscape and vegetation changes. And then the ecosystem fluxes were simulated as a function of those. And then the permafrost response from those other factors, as well as the direct influences of climate. The intention was eventually to end up with a more cyclical approach, fully coupled model, where you had the annual resolution in the alfresco model, but then the much more seasonal or even monthly interactions between the permafrost environment, the soil environment, and the ecosystem fluxes would then proceed on a finer time scale and then pass those inputs back to the alfresco model. And then that iteration would repeat forward for the duration of the future climate scenarios. The development of the model towards generation 2 and from generation 1 went through several different constructs as they were applied to different efforts. And those included the last National Climate Assessment, the Land Carb Soccer reports, several DoD projects that were funded directly through the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but then also independently uses of the outputs for specific resilience or adaptation efforts. And so there was to say that the development and the dialogue surrounding the development in terms of collaboration was tidy would be an overreach. In fact, it's very several threads going on at once. And you can see in this top graphic then that there were several user groups and input from different entities as the model was being developed over the last decade. And so this went through also different realizations of the CMIP climate model archive. It started under CMIP 3 and then included CMIP 5 model projections in the later versions of the model. So once fully structured and run, the way the data is served is through a library of data through our partners at SNAP at University of Alaska Fairbanks. I've put the link here and just given you an example of what you see when you go to access that data. There are primarily giant libraries of GeoTIFF, GIS or raster layers for the domain that you see there of Alaska and the Yukon and parts of British Columbia, mostly at 2-kilometer resolution, depending on the product. And the access is primarily through different downloads of GeoTIFF libraries. There are some products that are time series or tabular. It depends on the needs of the particular user, but you can go in and there's all of the input data. Most of the output data is available. I'll talk about some of the limitations on that in a little bit. But that's how it's served and made available. We also have a fair amount of output that currently isn't served online and hasn't even been summarized. And one example of this is the fire projections for future climate scenarios. I've shown two here on the left. The two columns there are two different climate models, the CGCM3 and CCSM4, and then for three different concentration pathways of greenhouse gases are the rows. And so you got 6 scenarios for 2 models and 3 RCPs there. That library is much larger than that. These were chosen as end members to give an idea of the range of scenarios. That often fits the scenario planning needs of a number of our stakeholders. But for modeling purposes, you may want to have a much larger library of scenarios. And those exist, but haven't been served yet, mostly because there hasn't been the resources and technical capacity to actually make that happen. We now have some USGS funding to do that more efficiently, make it more widely available. On the upper right, I'm showing you a map of federally managed places on the Alaska landscape, to give you some idea of the range of potential environments for which the model has been used and for which the stakeholders have some interest. Only to point out that there's a huge range, of course, in both ecological and climatological drivers of the model outputs. And the community is well aware that the vegetation and permafrost conditions vary substantially over that, for example. So you might expect very different model outputs for different purposes, different management resource interests, depending on where you look. But the point is there's a lot of different and a lot of heterogeneity in the information needs for planning purposes. and thus a lot of potential to use the model projections at least to partially inform those planning efforts. One of the kinds of outputs that we've been able to extract is in the lower right-hand corner, just to summarize. This is just the amount of white spruce in what was the Northwest Boreal Landscape Conservation Cooperative, which is a large swath of the boreal in central Alaska, interior Alaska primarily, and under historical climate, and then 5 different future climate scenarios for different GCMs. And then the range, the envelope there is just the range of model replicates that were run by reshuffling the climate and also the whatever parameters in the model are allowed to vary randomly. And so you get a range of potential responses across models and thus a range of futures. But that summarization can be done for very specific places, and the challenge has been more the capacity to put people in the dialogues and to have the time and capacity to do those summaries as needed. Another use of the model output has been the GIPL or permafrost lab projections. Here I'm just showing 4 that was shared by Vlad Romanovsky's group at UAF for different future scenarios of permafrost on the North Slope of Alaska for the 2090s under different scenarios. You can see the 2 on the right have 2 different landscape modifications that you might expect in the future. One is with development, so a 4-foot gravel pad, what that does to the active layer depth. And then one on the bottom, the increased organic layer that we might actually expect with future vegetation development as the climate becomes more favorable for vegetation. So simulating different future landscape outcomes as a function of those inputs. Those storylines depend on stakeholder dialogue, though, to develop them. And so those are just a few that have emerged from the conversations that they've had, and thus, only addressing some partial aspects of those future scenarios. Some lessons learned in the development so far. One is that coupling the models with their own development history. So each of these models had at least a decade of history before the idea that they wanted to couple them emerged. And their development stream wasn't done with that in mind. And we now see the rise of things like GitHub and model versioning and ways to control all of this much more directly, possibly as a result of these kinds of efforts. But if the labs and modelers want to collaborate broadly and engage in that coupling, we've got to approach programming like a business. And that's a direct quote from Scott Rupp, who learned this lesson in part the hard way by doing it, and not just getting it working so I can, quote, submit my next manuscript. And that actually comes home to roost, too, with the potential uses of this in contested landscapes in the future, for example, and management of different resources in ways that are quite different. These things need to be well documented and also reproducible. So that said, though, the differences between the model goals and the actual outcomes, that also varies with the scale of the critical model processes, which is something most modelers probably would have anticipated to begin with, but which isn't always as appreciated for management purposes. Depends on the user. For example, alfresco results would not be that much different prior to 2050 anyway, without full coupling from the productivity and active layer inputs from the other models, and the fuel availability and flammability are as much climatic at the scale of the model, which is 2 kilometers. But in contrast, there's much less progress than hoped on the carbon flux and permafrost changes in response to the fire severity changes we might expect in the future, just because of the programming challenges of getting the temporal scales between those models aligned. And that never really fully happened. The model is not quite fully coupled as we would have hoped in the past, and therefore isn't directly comparable with something like an Earth system model. An example of that is a DoD project at Fort Wainwright looking at future fire management and current fire management and the response of future fire in response to those fire management approaches. So these are different treatments on the landscape, different approaches to fire suppression in the Upper Tanana Basin. And one of the outcomes we see here in the alfresco model is that the differences, you can compare the differences between climate models. So here there's 2 different climate models, a warm one on top and a not as warm one on the bottom. And then also the changes in those different management approaches across the landscape. And with the old fire management simulation, and then some newer strategies that were imposed on the model. And one of the things that becomes clear if you had time to peruse these maps and compare closely is that the differences between the two climates, which are pretty big, are about as big as some of the differences in management. So you actually do have the potential to affect the direction of the fire system, at least at these sort of landscape scales and according to the fire model, depending on the fire management. And so that didn't depend as much on the permafrost or productivity as it did on the climate and management scenarios. And so in that case, it's probably not that big a deal that it's not as fully coupled. But there are other ones, for example, some of the permafrost responses for infrastructure where that would be an unfortunate outcome. Another lesson learned is if the goal is to actually have these model outputs be useful for decision relevant or decision context or adaptation work, the hard part is coupling those dynamic processes in multi-scale real time. The decision relevance for the stakeholders' decision context varies tremendously. Different communities versus different landscape management activities. So imagine the difference between an Alaska Native community and on the Yukon Delta and managing a wildlife refuge also on the Yukon Delta. So the differences really come home to roost depending on the stakeholders' needs. There also needs to be somebody with dedicated time to actually work between the stakeholder communities and the modeling team to help develop those dialogues and also translate what the model is capable of and what it's not. The dynamic global vegetation model community and Earth system modeling community tend towards some coarser scale approaches that miss the heterogeneity that's needed for fire behavior responses. So example there, if you're interested in species level habitat refugia for things that don't have very large home ranges or other processes like that, there's definitely value in doing something like this where you can aim for finer scale, but we're not fine enough even for some of those. And so we really have to be careful about communicating or at least finding ways to downscale those model approaches. The subgrid approaches are definitely hopeful in all cases, but at some point you really, that's where the observations really come home to roost. We're observation limited in this part of the Arctic and the Boreal. Finally, downscaling climate and especially the cryosphere dependent parts of the system in this region is really hard to match and validate at the scale that we need for the modeling approaches. And so we're definitely limited by observations, especially for things like permafrost, snow, fire severity, anything that's thresholdy in nature. And then I'll close by saying that the decision relevance environment is complicated. You're definitely working in a world where academic modeling approaches and scientific modeling approaches are stretching to reach utility for the decision relevant world, and the decision relevant world or management world, the decision makers are definitely stretching to reach to use the model output. And there are exceptions to these, but in general, this is a lot more complicated, sometimes as complicated as modeling. This is just a picture of the dimensions of that in wildfires in Alaska from a session that we had at AFE a couple of years ago. And there are clear needs to do this, but it's hard work. And observations and data and the modeling all come together in this. It's the best shot we've got to understand how the future is different, but we have to do it right. So in that spirit, data availability is not enough. You can't just do the loading dock model where you make this stuff available, and we're guilty as charged here. The current archive of IEM output is mostly useful to researchers who have skills in R, Python, that sort of thing. Some of the agency applications can rely on those in-house skills, but it's getting to the point where a lot of the regional management entities and agencies don't have the staff that they would need to ingest these and do the translation on the fly themselves. There are some, but they're overworked and there's not enough capacity to meet the need that exists. So the co-produced tool development is a potential way forward there, where you've got the academic world and the management world working together to build tools that bridge that gap. But that requires dedicated personnel, and we've got a paper on that out there about the IEM and that process. So I've included after this slide several schematics of model diagrams for anybody who wants to look at them, to look at the different structures of those models, at least conceptually. But I'm out of time, and I should close and pass it off to our next speaker.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I think we'll wait to address any questions. But feel free to put them in the chat for now so we have a record of them. Until after our next speaker, hopefully we can reserve the last 10 minutes or so and have a nice discussion. So the next speaker is Brian Wee, and we've already introduced him. Take it, Brian. Thank you.
Let me unmute myself. And again, Jonathan, thanks for inviting Bill and I to talk about what we have been experimenting with in the ESIP world. So I will use this one slide, the next slide, if I can get this to advance, to contextualize this talk in terms of what Jeremy had just expounded on. Now, so when essentially this is the punchline of the talk, right? This talk is to highlight some of the experiments, and I would like to highlight experiments that we have tried over the past 1 year plus, we meaning the agriculture and climate cluster, in reuse and discovery of data and information across a broad range of users. And so, for example, to contextualize this diagram against what Jeremy just talked about, Jeremy had talked about for ingesting data into models and coupling models. And so part of this talk later, we'll talk about, in terms of interoperability of data. As many of you know, it gets to be a challenge trying to find the relevant data that you can ingest into your model. And there's a lot of data prep. And also, even before you prep your data, there's a lot of head scratching as to determining whether that variable in this data set, is it really the same variable that you need in this model? So that takes quite a bit of time. And we will not talk too much about this, but this talk will address that a bit. And there's a slide later in this talk where we're going to talk about things like if you use the scientific workflow management system to chain models together, where the model output from one model will be ingested into another model. How do you ensure that one can trace and reproduce the steps that you took? And this is called, of course, provenance. So for a given model output, show me how you got to your result. So again, this talk touches a little bit on provenance, the history, but not too much. But applied to fire management, and one last thing I'd like to mention in terms of what Jeremy had mentioned. So Jeremy also talked about model outputs being used for management decisions, right? And in IARPC's case, for example, you might also want to say, how has your model output affected a IARPC performance element, right? So again, this gets to the idea of traceability and provenance. And this is what this talk is about. So this talk is really about how do you make data, the model output from models, publications and decisions, how do you make all this traceable through this value chain, but also make the data and information as a result of this process discoverable to other users, other communities who are in different, who have a different worldview. So in this picture here, the worldview corresponds to, are you a community that is focused mainly on mitigation planning versus a community who is dealing with when the fire is, when there's an active fire going? Are you the firefighting community, or are you the after fire mitigation community? So again, how do you enable data and information to be discoverable throughout all this, and eventually traceable to management decisions, and like I said, things like the IARPC performance elements. So what's implicit in this diagram are things like tracing data to decisions, which I just mentioned, right? And representing social and environmental systems. And this talk will be organized in these two parts. So without further ado, let's launch into part one. A quick mention though, ESIP, sponsored by NASA, NOAA, and USGS. And this is the name of our cluster, our meaning Bill Ting and I co-lead this agriculture and climate cluster. And the ESIP cluster has a rough equivalent to IARPC cell-forming teams. I might be misinterpreting this since I'm relatively new to this community, but that is what I can gather from the website. And some of the other ESIP groups that work with our agriculture and climate cluster are what is shown here on the screen, including something called the semantics harmonization cluster, which I will mention later on in the talk. So with that, part one. Data to decisions. All right, you've seen this already. I will not spend too much time. You know what we're talking about here is tracing the transformation of data eventually into management decisions. And this diagram here essentially points out to you the state of knowledge about how the machine is able to track what you do to data through a model. Now that kind of tracking and traceability is relatively well known. There are standards, and the community knows how to record the series of steps that a model uses to ingest data to produce model data. This space is well known. The US Global Change Research Program, the USGCRP, deals a lot with tracing information back to data and models, and I'll give you an example next. But the traceability of management decisions back to everything else before that, that's a little bit harder. And so there was an ESIP funded project in which, again, a small team of us, we experimented and we tried to poke around this whole traceability chain. Now, let's go back to the USGCRP to talk about that front part of that provenance chain. The USGCRP has a system called the Global Change Information System, the GCIS, where my cursor is hovering. So this is an example of an entry in the GCIS where the indicator sea ice extent in the GCIS, there is provenance that tells you this indicator is used in this report and cited in this report, right? And so there is a provenance record of figures, data, and users in the GCIS so that any finding is traceable. Any NCA finding, the National Climate Assessment finding, is traceable. Okay, and this is an example of another experiment that our cluster experimented with. Now, this is again a traceability experiment by using concept maps. Now, these concept maps are mostly for humans to trace. For example, what you see here is a community wildfire protection plan in Colorado, right? You can follow the trace that this community had used this wildfire portal. This is a tool in again, mapping back to Jeremy's talk. This is a tool, right? It's a tool that the community used to create their plan, and you can ultimately trace the ingest of landfire data by this tool, but the ingest of landfire data by the CoRep tool further traces back to Landsat data, and you can of course trace it all the way back. And so the cluster has done a couple of experimental concept maps that traces that follows this trace kind of way back to the data end of things. All right. Now for the second part of the talk, and where I would like to conclude, is talking about representing complex social and environmental systems. And the previous slide where we have community decisions and tracing that back to data, that should give you a clue as to where we're going for the next part of the talk. I'm not going to spend too much on this diagram since I've already spent quite a bit of time on this. But the way to think about enabling the traceability from data to decisions is to think about interoperability. So interoperability, unfortunately, it means a lot of things to lots of people. I mean, when we talk about interoperability of sensors, environmental sensors, for example, you can think about, can I integrate sensor data from this sensor with this other sensor? That's interoperability. But here we're talking about informatics interoperability. Going back again to Jeremy's talk about integrating data and passing data, coupling models. Now, what I'm showing here on the right-hand side is, for example, it's a workflow manager, a scientific workflow manager. So again, the name of the game is how do you make sure that your data upfront is interoperable with a model, and how do you make sure that your model output is interoperable with downstream models, right? So that is the name of the game for the informatics folks, of which I count myself one of them, right? And one of the answers to enabling this interoperability, meaning this ability to chain things together and to integrate things together, is what we call semantics, so semantic technology, and that's where I'm going with the rest of the talk. So in a semantically enabled search engine, for example, when you look for the term rain, the search engine will know that, if there are data sets labeled with precipitation or snow, you may be interested in those data sets too. So that's what I mean by semantics. Now, this is an example again of the knowledge that is represented in a semantic technology called, and is enabled through this thing called an ontology. I won't go into the definitions here too much, but as you can see here in this ontology, sea ice formation process, right, is known to the machine as a type of water ice formation process. And a water ice formation process has an output of water ice. So these ontologies allow the machine to do a limited amount of reasoning, so that when you look for things, not just data, but when you look for information in a text, the machine can help figure out, what are the relevant pieces of data and what are the relevant pieces of documents that you might want to look into, right? And so the Ag and Climate Cluster and the Semantic Harmonization Cluster, we initiated another experiment recently to enable this kind of interoperability for wildfire-related data and information. So it's important, data and information. But we started the experiment by focusing on these things called values at risk, meaning that what are the things that humans care about that may be lost in a wildfire, and also planning polygons where folks in the firefighting arena, they use these polygons to break down the landscape into smaller pieces for planning purposes. So again, values at risk are things like property, biodiversity, natural resources, and so on and so forth. But you need, again, the machine to understand what do you mean by natural resources. And that's where folks around the room sit together and create diagrams like the diagram that I showed you before about sea ice extent. The same thing about planning polygons. This is a scene from Boulder, but what do you mean by polygons, and how do you construct these polygons based on qualities of the landscape? That's again another step to do in knowledge capture. So that's part of the experiment. And this, just very quickly to point out here that this is a screenshot of what happened when we brought together the subject matter expert and the knowledge representation experts in the field, where you captured knowledge related to forest ecosystem processes, but we also captured knowledge related to the human condition, transient populations that are part of the vulnerable population. And so this is a way where you can integrate both natural and human processes. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to skip over a couple of different slides. But this slide here is just to point out that actually Scott Rupp and I had co-authored a poster a few years ago that talked about these integration and decision-making around coupled human natural systems for Alaskan communities that are threatened by climate change. So what I like to do is run all the way to the end, and we will probably stop here. But where I want to talk, where this slide is important, despite my lack of time, because what you see on this slide is, again, another little experiment that our cluster did, where we use this technology called a graph database, right, to connect a data set. These are data sets produced by NASA Goddard Space Flight Center to publications. So these are all journal publications. And these journal publications address various concepts related to carbon management. So carbon offsets, wood, climate change, weather, range, watershed. Now, the Neo4j database, graph database, is able to connect these publications to a so-called Climate 21 USDA memo. So before President Biden's inauguration, there was a team of ex-Obama administration officials who put together recommendations to the incoming Biden team, captured in this Climate 21 US memo. So this database was used, this Neo4j database was used to identify commonalities between what the team was recommending to the Biden administration, how it connected to publications, and how those are connected to data. And so in the context of this talk, think about using such a similar capability to connect your work, for example, to IARPC performance elements. And with that, I should end here. And this is kind of a quick visual recap of the things that we did and the contact information for both Bill and I. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was a lot of information. And of course, I've seen this before, so I was still learning new things. I was in that workshop last week when Pierre was documenting the the terminology from the fire manager from Boulder. So that's very exciting work. I want to open it now. We don't have a ton of time, but I want to encourage us to ask questions. There's questions we can pull from the chat, but in particular, I'm interested in the dialogue along the theme of this this meeting, and what we're trying to accomplish is how these two groups, they're dabbling in modeling and data management respectively, and trying to figure out standards so they can do this in a more efficient, repeatable way. Are there any questions that people want to bring up to the group? And if not, we can look in the chat.
So one question that came to mind when I listened to Jeremy's presentation, I'm working on the DOE side, and I know there are some activities, projects like NG Arctic, and like some modeling of the terrestrial realm, like the Arctic Terrestrial Simulator, for instance. And I was just wondering, is there, first of all, I assume that you're aware of those efforts. What are the kind of the complementary and the kind of overlapping aspects of those efforts? I was wondering if you could shed some light on that for us.
Yeah, I am aware of them, and at the risk of getting it wrong, I'll tell you what I think I know. I think Scott would be in a much better position to answer that question. I don't think he wasn't able to participate today, but my understanding is that a lot of the participants in the development of the models that went into the IEM are participants in those dialogues and that community as well, and those efforts, but that there is very limited envisioned development further of the IEM based on what's happening in that dialogue, if that makes any sense. So in other words, I think the participants have said, okay, we're going to shelve this for now. We're going to move on and do these other things, and use those different models and different modeling efforts independently if needed for that work, but that the future coupling of the IEM is not yet set to be informed by what comes out of NG Arctic. Does that make sense?
I guess it does. Great, thank you.
It would be of huge advantage if that were the case, and I think that we can continue to support the development and funding of it. But I think it's also a question that needs to be answered: is that the best approach, or does NG Arctic and other work suggest a different strategy and different coupled modeling approach than the IEM itself? And I don't know the answer to that. You'd have to. I'd say that one's for Scott.
Great, thank you.
Something this reminds me of is a analogous situation from mineralogy that I learned about last week, where totally unrelated to IARPC, but there were a number of discipline experts, and they're doing modeling of their own accord, and they got a big $100 million grant from some foundation, and they said, here's funding to solve the big problems in mineralogy. But wait a second, a requirement for this funding is you have to work with these data scientists, and you have to try to develop something with them. So they followed, they were more than happy to take the money and work with the data scientists, and they came up with a data-driven approach to modeling minerals that was totally revolutionary for their field. So I think that's what we're really talking about here for terrestrial ecology and modeling is, yes, we need to solve these disciplinary challenges to modeling, but we also need to infuse it with data science. And so we can do this and in a way that makes this a data-driven enterprise.
Jonathan, I'd ask a question from the observing point of view, if that doesn't take us off off the track.
No, that sounds good. And I'm trying to find connections between the foundational areas. So I appreciate your point of view.
Yeah, sure. So I appreciate both the talks and one of my curiosities in joining the call is that we're trying to use more of a systems approach to identify observing gaps that could, potentially through filling an observing gap, pay multiple dividends across numerous decision-making contexts or modeling settings and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering, this is maybe a question for Brian, but I think Jeremy's probably got insight into it as well. Do you ask any questions about observing system gaps as you're working on these, on developing these more complex integrated model and decision support systems while you have subject matter experts sort of at the table? Or is that kind of, are you guys really looking at the problem from the data sets on down, like what you have in hand?
So I'll just take a quick shot at that. Sandy, at least for our experiments, we take a lot more, we look at the data sets down onwards. For stakeholder engagement, we do try to do that. For example, in this experiment that we just kicked off last week, we actually had a retired firefighter from Boulder who is coming in to help us over the next couple of weeks/months, where the ESUP groups will try to essentially interview him and capture him and determine his requirements. But I don't think we have engaged stakeholders as much as we need to, at least from our group, because we're mostly a volunteer group at ESUP. In fact, a lot of the work that you saw was based on the volunteer work. But I do acknowledge what you're saying in the need when you talk to stakeholders to trace your needs back to the observation gaps. Because I was part of an earlier the White House, this was a couple of years back, the Earth Observation Portfolio Assessment Team, where we had tried to find where the gaps are with respect to some of the USGS observation needs and trace it back to the state of the observing system, at least with the civil observation system. So that was an exercise done, I think, has been done twice in the past 8-9 years. And I've yet to see whether this administration will undertake that same exercise, the Earth Observation Portfolio Assessment exercise.
Yeah, this is Jeremy. I think Brian covered it well. I think we can always imagine, places where the model's ability to give us back what we have already observed, and further validation and that sort of thing could be aided by more observation. I think, especially when we make inferences about the hydrologic outcomes, the fire severity impacts, especially with like alfresco. And I think Lisa Saperstein's on here and probably could talk more about this even than I can. But the observations that we don't get from remote sensing and that don't lend themselves to interpolation very well. So temperature, precipitation, arguably we can do that okay. But the more we get into extremes, the more we get into things that are harder to remotely sense well and then have bigger errors, the further we get off into a world where the model simulations look sound from our perspective, but we can't really validate. And therefore the future scenarios and errors are not necessarily known in magnitude. And so as long as the system continues to operate the way it's parameterized in the model, then that's fine. But there are interactions between some of those variables or parameters that might surprise us in the future. And I think the observations have a way of telling us when we're wrong there. But if I had to point to things that I'd really like to see, not so much for the IEM's capabilities, but for what our stakeholders need, it's more observations of the factors that end up affecting coastal flooding in communities. And so the interaction of extreme precipitation and storms and permafrost changes and that sort of thing. But there, all of those are clusters of observations, and they're things that are difficult to measure well. So maybe that's another conversation, maybe not a satisfying answer.
Good food for thought. Thanks, everybody.
Excuse me, this is Nancy French. Can I just say something really quickly as things get wrapped up?
Sure.
I'm part of the Above program, and we have a few people on here that are involved with Above, the NASA program to do observational science to understand some of the gaps and feed some of the gaps that are in the systems that we're talking about. And we have a fire disturbance working group that's working on synthesizing various aspects of what Above is producing. And I just want to throw out there that we'd be very happy to coordinate with the activities that you guys are showing us today, because obviously we're going down the same paths. Data needs for modeling is really where we were headed in our synthesis of tundra fire impacts. So I'd love to have a conversation and see how we can overlap and make sure that we're not going down different paths and things like that.
Thank you, Nancy. I think that's a perfect thing to tackle in the IARPC context and under the new 5-year plan. So let's make that an action for all of us to follow up on this meeting and all the great ideas that were presented. So it's the top of the hour. If there's any other burning questions, we can hear a quick one, or we'll just call it for the day. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. This is a great productive meeting, and I look forward to discussing this more in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody. This was an interesting session.
Thank you.
Thank you.